Okay, welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar. This is week 13, and sorry for everybody. This is kind of a bit of an issue here with Zoom being out today, so we're on Teams. Our speaker today is Dr. Richard Love. He's currently a professor at the National Defense University in the College of Information and Cyberspace. And today he's going to be speaking to us about Russian hacking. Why, how, who, and to what end? Richard, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Michael. Just a quick note about National Defense University. We're here in Washington, D.C., on the grounds of Fort McNair. We teach primarily senior civilians and senior military officers to get them ready for their leadership roles, mostly at the lieutenant colonel level, Navy captain level equivalent, and 1 stars, and we have a program for 3 stars. So it's great to be here. My student audience is a little older, I'm guessing, than Purdue's graduate program and undergraduate program for sure. But don't worry, a lot of what I have to say today is going to be very relevant to what you're learning and what your career objectives are. So I hope you find this fruitful. By all means, if you want to use the chat function, I'll try to, with the other eye, monitor any questions that may come up. And I always prefer an interactive dialogue so that if you do have questions, maybe I'll stop what I'm doing if I think it's relevant. Otherwise, I'll get to them at the end of the lesson. Okay, I'm going to share some slides for you, with you. Okay, so I hope they're coming through.
Yep, got them.
Super, thanks. What I'm going to talk about today is what the heck is Russia doing? Why are they using cyber tools as a means to disrupt adversaries, to do things like interfere with elections, how they do it, what tools that they use, and what their objectives are, why they're doing it. And I hope through a discussion of that, you'll have a better sense of how to approach when you're hearing in the news that the Russians are engaged in some sort of cyber activities. You have a better understanding of what they're trying to achieve. Okay. So, and by the way, my throat, forgive me. It's a high pollen day here in Washington. So I'm struggling like many of my colleagues, but just bear with me and I'll do the best I can. So, before we talk necessarily about cyber attacks, let me kind of set the background for you. There are a lot of things that are different between the Russian Federation and the people of Russia than how we would think about them in the United States. Okay, so the first takeaway here is they're all about achieving their state interests. And importantly, there's really no distinction between industry, the private sector, and the people. They're all one. So if you think, if you're negotiating a trade deal, or in my case, if I've negotiated with representatives of the Russian Federation, if you think you're having a conversation with industry and state, understand that they've already interacted. Okay, they're working in concert, right? They're highly centralized, but they don't have a clue generally what other parts of the government are doing or what the other parts of industry are doing. Okay, their leaders are revered. Why is Putin still so popular in Russia? And a lot of it has to do with propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, but there's a long history of seeing their czars and their leaders like Stalin as dynamic leaders. Though it's worth noting they have had 4 czars assassinated in the past. And there's very much, and this is a trend, say within the past 20 years, this notion that elements of Greater Russia are non-severable. So what do I mean like that? Right. So states like Georgia, an independent state, Ukraine, an independent state, Latvia, an independent Baltic state, Lithuania, Estonia, Mongolia, even. They may be different races, but they all belong to one sovereign. This is Putin's perspective. This is what he says, right? He constantly dismisses notions that Ukrainians are ever entitled to sovereignty, similar to the Georgians. And that is one of the reasons the Baltic states are very concerned about what's Putin's next move, right? So a little bit about Russian perceptions. And by the way, these are all my opinions. Okay, these are my insights I'm sharing with you because I've lived in Russia. I've traveled there a number of times. And yes, it is that cold. It's very cold, particularly in some of the places I've been, like Siberia. So there's been kind of a historical development over how Russians perceive, for example, the West and the United States. There is a long, deep-seated feeling in Russian, and by the Russian people, that Americans are tricksters and con artists, right? I have had more than a number of people in Russia tell me, hey, look at what you did to us to Alaska, right? They remember a lot of these old perceived gotcha moments, right? There are also Russians, and it's in Russian, deep in Russian literature, that love Americans. Tolstoy was all about the American soul, Dostoevsky, freedom. Stalin, he loved American culture. He loved American film to the point where he made his Politburo and some of his inner circle watch American films at 3 o'clock in the morning. He loved it. But then there's this distrust of the US, right? Fear of encirclement, fear of being backwards, fear of falling behind, being second rate, inferior. And, you know, when you negotiate with the Russians, they come in hard. They're ready to play. Anytime you give them an inch, that's a done deal for them. So if you think you've agreed on something when negotiating with the Russians, first of all, when they come back the next time, they will tell you, we didn't agree on that. And secondly, when you think you have not agreed on something with the Russians, and it was quite clear, they will come back to you and they will say, now that we settled that last time, let's talk about this. So they come in very strong. So where does cybersecurity fit in all this? So the purpose of my discussion is really to talk about how the Russians view cybersecurity and how that's different. One of the big challenge for American policymakers and diplomats is they have a tendency, even though they have been trained otherwise, to mirror image, still think that deep inside the Russian brain is an American brain hoping to get out. Nothing could be further from the truth. Okay. So when you talk about, for example, cybersecurity, there's no such thing as cybersecurity in Russia. Okay, the closest they have is that all information from wherever it comes from, how it's generated, you know, there's no distinction between information versus data. You know, who has ownership of that? It's all part of cyber. Okay. And the reason is, and I'll cut to the chase, is Russia believes they are always in a state of conflict, competition, or combat with the United States and the West. There's no security, offensive tools and defensive tools. They're just tools to be used to further Russian objectives. Okay. This is this is just not an opinion. This is the Security Council of the Russian Federation saying that information technology will be used for political and military purposes, right? Politics by other means. Right? Clausewitz used that concept to say what war is. Russia uses that concept to talk about everything, including cyber. You hear this term down here in the last bullet, applying the Gerasimov way of war. Gerasimov's an interesting character. He's the um, basically he's the head of armed forces in Russia. He wrote a document years ago about using asymmetric tools to combat the West. And it's been described as the Gerasimov Doctrine. I'll talk about that a little later. Just to let you know, if you ever hear that term, the Gerasimov Doctrine wasn't wasn't coined by him, nor is it a doctrine. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is the bigger picture of where cyber fits into their kind of national security concept. Let's see. So what is it? Russia uses every element of state power to achieve and to further their state interests. Information, diplomacy, economics, and the military. They all are used hand in hand. When they sit down and think about, okay, how are we going to achieve the state objectives? They do not take war and cyber war off the table. Okay. All of the elements of state power are at their disposal to achieve a political end. That does not mean that each of these elements doesn't come with it higher or lower risks. Will Russia always use warfare to get it to achieve its state ends, its state political objectives? Of course not. But it's not off the table. Okay. So for the Russians, whether or not a state of war exists is really irrelevant for us for people who have been in the policy world, right? That concept of competition, political engagement, information strategies, everything from hacking, influence operations, right, to operations below the level of armed conflict, are all part of the process for achieving it. Okay. This is in their doctrine. This is in their operational art. Operational art is merely how they think about conducting operations. Let me give you a good example. When Russia wanted to invade Ukraine the first time, they started with a massive cyber attack in 2014, which was very successful. All right. Preceding and then complementing the military attack that followed, that took back the Donbass, parts of the Donbass and Crimea. Okay. Why was that unique? Because Westerners still view, for example, cyber attacks and cyber threats and as something that you do before war, not hand in hand with war, right? So again, the Russian mind is not an American mind seeking to break out, right? This is how they think about warfare. This is how they think about using cyber tools. Okay. And we're seeing more of that, not less. Okay. Again, I already mentioned Ukraine in 2014, also in the end of 2021. The attack actually occurred in February 24th, 2022. It was also seen in Georgia earlier in 2008. It has a couple of central principles. Okay. Political aims are what matters. Military objectives are aligned with political aims. The use of deception and indirect asymmetric approaches to weaken adversaries. What's an asymmetric approach? If Russia invades something, they expect to be hit with a military response. But if they can stay in that area where the adversary will respond below the level of conflict, they win in their minds. Right? One of the best tools to do that, they have found, is cyber, is through the use of malware hidden as something else. So let me wrap this up in a way that is a little easier to digest. First, what do we think in the West? Political, military, information, economic measures are the things you do to prevent war. It's what you do to keep the world sane, from falling into conflict, to maintaining peace where economies can thrive. The Russian way of war sees these instruments of state power as the tools of war. They are at war. All of these tools can be used in concert. How they're used can depend on different timelines. And when they're used, again, will determine the political objective that they seek. Okay, it's a big change in their perception of how to use cyber tools versus how we use them, for example, in the United States. Okay. What do we want in the West? We want to do everything we can to prevent war. We will use, and we are careful to use our cyber tools in a way where the unintended consequences that might be unforeseeable could impact the greater global commons. Because once these cyber tools are used, if they go beyond their intended use, they can have dramatic impacts on adversaries, allies, and partners alike, right? And I'll talk a little bit about the election case on the next slide, but that's a good example of how Russia used hacking and manipulation to impact the U.S. democratic process here in the United States, right? Did it trigger a U.S. military response? Of course not. Did it have the strategic effect that the Russians hoped it would have? I argue, yeah, it did. So what did that look like? Well, before I get to that, what were some of the initiatives that the Russians pursued in 2016? The first is military intelligence, which is the GRU, attacked the Democratic National Committee, hacked its accounts, successfully hacked into high-ranking Democratic members, for example, Hillary Clinton, John Podesta, among others. It was attributed to Russian military intelligence well after all of this had occurred. The emails were then released on platforms like WikiLeaks, created a media frenzy, arguably damaged Clinton campaign. But the longer term consequences were, do you remember the congressional hearings, right? That went into how did our election get hacked? Who did it? And can you prove it? Right? And the answer was, we can't prove it. We can pretty demonstrably say it was them. We know it was on WikiLeaks, but where they got their information, it's hard to tell. Right? You also have Russian intelligence, not the Russian military intelligence, but Russian intelligence doing things like creating fake social media accounts, and the targets are going after you. They're going after you and your congressional districts, saying, if you feel this way about an issue, go to this rally. Okay. If you think this way about X, and they know you do because they have been tracking what you've been looking at, then go over here and click this website, where, not surprisingly, a lot of data that is laid out that aligns perfectly with you gives you a reason to vote this way or that way, right? And the more contentious that election got, the better and more accurate Russian intelligence got at finding particular segments of populations within congressional districts. Yes, it was very narrowly focused to try to have an influence. Oh, by the way, in 2016, this was not limited to the United States, right? Almost every major election in 2016 and in 2020. One thing that I like to point out is there were 50 major elections at the prime minister, president level that occurred globally in 2024. Russia tried to impact many of them. Okay. So the impact, severe, like we had never seen before, particularly following 2016. State-backed media outlets, RT, Sputnik, spreading false narratives, misleading information. And the purpose, yes, was perhaps to have the US population vote against Hillary Clinton. The strategic importance is that what these attacks, offensive cyber attacks, tried to do was to delegitimize US elections and confidence in the US elections. That's the strategic goal here. And in 2020 and 2024, that is what the Russian intelligence service continued to work on. Okay. Impact unprecedented, right? Erosion of public trust in democratic processes, polarization. So, one of the things you could argue is, look, did the Russian influence in 2016 do enough to sway an election? No. That's great news. But if their strategic objectives was to sow doubt into the legitimacy of the US election process, where people would call into question, did the systems work? Is the election being stolen? Right? Where are all these, there are clips of stolen ballots, or what's happening? If their objective was to sow discord and undermine trust, they were successful at it. And something we still have to confront for every election, probably forever. By the way, just on how they actually do some of these things, when it comes to the elections, I'll tell you, the first thing they do is they will go out and they will write, for example, an opinion perspective piece that says we have evidence that in the US, the Democratic Secretary of State in this state, or Republican, it doesn't matter, has been accused of promising to sway the election. That's down in a remote thing. Then it gets picked up by RT television and radio, are a Russian paid for news service. It'll get picked up by RT, or it'll get picked up by Agency France Presse, which is a French news service. And then guess who will pull from those feeds, right? Because it deals with the US election, the AI now, which is writing many of the articles that go in, for example, to the US media, will pick that up and pull it. And then you're talking about some misinformation and disinformation problems. Okay, so other ways they do it, cyber espionage. There are Russia state-sponsored groups. You may hear about these. APT is Advanced Persistent Threat. That's something we call them, and we give them numbers, and then we give them monikers like Fancy Bear, Cozy Bear. These are basically cells within the Soviet Union. These are basically cells within Russia that engage in offensive cyber operation. That's all they are, okay? And it's just jargon so that in the West, we can talk about them and have a more fuller understanding of between intelligence agencies, policymakers of what the heck's going on with the Russians, right? They also attack critical infrastructure. And let me tell you something about the difference between the Russian concept of cyber warfare and the United States. It is almost unthinkable that the United States would put out a cyber bug or a cyber weapon without having an antidote for it. Russia, not so much. Right? Russia builds tools in the cyber domain to have effects. They're not all that concerned about what happens if effects go wrong. They don't need, before they use them, to fully understand what the magnitude of the threat could be, what the level of unintended consequences might rise to, and even whether or not it might hurt them. Okay. Good heavens, what are you talking about? Well, I've got a case study for you, an example. I hope you guys have heard about the 2017 NotPetya attack. This was Russia's way to punish Ukraine. Excuse me a second. In 2014, Russia invades Ukraine, captures Crimea. 2017, the Ukrainians are learning their lesson. They're working with the United States. They're working with the West, European countries to improve their cyber defenses. You may also remember that, right, when Russia captured those two, quote, breakaway republics in Ukraine, that the Ukrainians started pushing back. So Russia gets upset and they create a cyber warfare tool called NotPetya, and they attack Ukraine. It looks like ransomware. So what's the big deal about ransomware? You get it, you pay some money, and hopefully you get your information back, right? It was disguised wiper malware. What's wiper malware? Malware. So basically, once that's in your system, right, NotPetya was designed to delete it, kill it. Okay. So they're playing a ransomware game, right? It's not sure where it's come from, but it starts to spread globally. Why? Because Ukrainian tax software, including the Ukrainian government links to, for example, large multinational corporations, Maersk, FedEx, Merck, right? They're all infected. The infections spread globally. And not only globally, but they turned around and shut down the Russian banks for 7 days, right? So this is a pretty severe attack. It paralyzed critical infrastructure, disrupted global supply chains, right? And it really woke the world up to, man, we've got to be more sensitive to how the Russians play the game in the cyber domain versus how the rest of the world plays it. The intent was strategic to punish Ukraine. It was designed and it was thought to have a specific and limited effect. It would not go beyond the borders of Ukraine. It would not come back to impact the Russian Federation. But once that was out, right, its reach was indiscriminate, right, and had an impact far, far greater than was ever intended. What did it also show? Attribution problems, deniability opportunities of the Russians, obfuscation. Hey, this NotPetya thing's coming from Russia. Russia, fix it. It's not ours. Yeah, we can tell it originated from Russia, hit Ukraine, and now it's all over the world, and people can't do global trade. Fix it. Russia's response: prove it. We had nothing to do with this. Well, okay. It looks like you guys are involved somehow. I don't know what you're talking about. Why did you shut your banks down, Russia, for 7 days? In truth, it was like 3 to 7 days. Depends on the bank. Well, we're suffering just like everybody else, right? The Russians came back and said, why are you yelling at us? We're suffering just like you. And to prove it, we had to shut our banks down too, just like everybody else. We would never do something like send a weapon like NotPetya into the global commons because we would be damaged too. So you see where I'm going, right? So what did Russia successfully do here? Acted below the level of armed conflict to get a strategic effect it was looking for. Operating in that gray zone. Is it war? Is it criminal? Is it illegal? Is it a violation of a norm? What happened? Right? Billions of dollars were lost. Nobody. Anyway, who's going to pay for that? Okay. This is emblematic of the Russian way of war and cyber war. So think about this. NotPetya was purely a cyber operation. But did it rival in its effects to what a conventional military strike against critical infrastructure might have been? So when Russia takes a hypersonic weapon or just a missile and destroys critical infrastructure or wipes out the banking system, is that an act of war? Heck yeah. That's why there's a war in Ukraine and Russia, though the Russians still characterize it as a military activity, right? Well, we've got to be careful here. No single missile could take down an entire banking system. No single missile could take offline the Ukrainian government's ability to interact with its population, which is what NotPetya did. NotPetya is not also it also is acting in combination with a broader set of activities, misinformation, right? Propaganda. In order for, and the threat of military action, remember, they're in there. They're fighting in Ukraine and Crimea, right? This is going hand in hand with military action and cyber action to get the Ukrainians to bleed, and to quit. Okay. So a couple of quick comments on who the heck is doing this. So the best way I can describe the players without getting too deep into acronyms and who's fighting who for the privilege of attacking the United States and Ukraine and the West and Asia is to get in your minds that there is a difference between the Russian military and the Russian intelligence services. Until a few years ago, the big actor in Russian offensive cyber operations was the military. And that has changed dramatically. Okay. And I guess you can think and rationalize why that has happened. Well, has the military been successful in Ukraine? Has the intelligence they've generated that led to the attack on Ukraine proven itself right? Is the intelligence that the military is producing in Ukraine accurate today? But first and foremost, who is Vladimir Putin? Vladimir Putin is a lieutenant colonel, retired, in the KGB. He quit the KGB in order to associate himself with Yeltsin. He then climbed up on the coattails of Yeltsin through the intelligence world. And by the time Boris Yeltsin was ready to retire, Boris Yeltsin's handpicked successor was standing right there, a former KGB guy, Vladimir Putin. Long way of saying, Vladimir Putin speaks intelligence. He knows the intelligence service. He was an intelligence operative in East Germany, spying on West Germany and the Baltic states. He understands intelligence, right? He's not a retired military officer. He's very suspicious of the military, particularly when they are seen to be lying to him, and everything that they remember. Putin built up a brand new military. While we, the United States, were all fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, what did the Russians do? They didn't have anybody to fight other than occasionally the Chechens. But what they did was invest in upgrading their military. And by that, I mean their equipment and also improving their soldiers' capability. Okay. So here you have a brand new military tool, and the military says, we're ready to go, sir. And Putin says, let's go into Ukraine. I'm tired of those guys. And they're not sovereign at all. They're just a appendage of Russia. We should go take them. The military operation collapses within a week at the cost of tremendous loss of lives, right? Equipment, thousands of tanks, hundreds of airplanes, hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, right? So where we are today is the main intelligence, the Federal Security Service. Okay, there are three, right? So you've got the Federal Security Service, the FSB, that is focused internally, but they also play a role in cyber operations when they feel that cyber operations are being used against their country, right? Then you have the Foreign Intelligence Service. These are the guys I'm talking about that have a bigger influence than they used to. They're much more well They're much more well resourced than in the past, right? And then you have Russia's military intelligence agency, right? So what does this mean? They have overlapping jurisdictions, all three of them, and there's intense competition for prestige, resources, power, attention. You're looking to outperform the other guys. However, they're pretty formidable. We do not know when they use their cyber tools what the full capabilities of some of those tools are. I think I'll leave it at that. So there's an example here. So SolarWinds begins in 2019. We don't find out about it until the end of December 2020. So SolarWinds is going on. It is a campaign targeting SolarWinds. I'll talk about that in a second. We don't find out about it for over a year. Okay. Basically, it's the insertion of malicious code into platform updates. You know how you always get updates, right? So just like any software, you're constantly getting updates. The Russians were able to install malicious code into those updates. And this is an IT monitoring capability, right, that is used globally by everyone. And so what did they do? They were in there for a year before anybody knew about it, collecting everything they could. And this is done by that arm, the Foreign Intelligence Services, the intelligence folks in Russia. And they stole sensitive data, raised a ton of concerns, because at the end of the day, there's not a good understanding of what was stolen and what the effects might be. Okay, so let me wrap up with this. What does this all mean? Here are some thoughts. First, expect Russia to continue to push the envelope with cyber attacks. They will explore seams and gaps in defenses. They will test laws and regulations. They will find areas where there is overlap and confusion, and they will look for vulnerabilities. This is going to be more pervasive going forward than less. I think particularly with the status of NATO and new relationships globally, and the position of the Trump administration will leave the Russians pushing hard in all directions all at once. Okay. And we're already seeing that. The Russians will continue to invest in artificial intelligence. They will try to steal anything they can related to information, machine learning, quantum, and artificial intelligence. If you see a geopolitical shift, the Russians are going to look for their cyber toolbox first. Okay. There are cyber operations from Russia going on right now that merit a response. And we in the West are still stuck trying to figure out, is this a military threat? Is this a criminal threat? Do I go to a public defender? I'm sorry, a prosecutor? Do I go to the FBI for investigations and prosecuting? Or do I call the Defense Department? Okay. Don't forget, Russia also has vulnerabilities, and they're concerned about them, right? They're also vulnerable to their own tools. I think last thing I'll point out, especially with relationship to how the U.S. is now approaching the United Nations, for example. They are looking to drive the discussion on norms and rules of the road for cyber and for artificial intelligence, something I'm involved in. Okay. And I think the Russians and the Chinese, with their concept of cyber sovereignty, are going to be pushing on that over the next 4 years. So with that, let me unshare and see if there are any comments. I'd love to hear some comments. Anything that I missed or needs correction, I'd love to engage.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dr. Love.
Yeah, Michael.
So attendees, you could, we're in teams here, so it's a little bit different than usual. So you can raise your hand, I'll turn on your mic, or you can put a question in the chat, and we'll try to answer that. Richard, I was just kind of thinking, like, looking at your slides, for like the misinformation like stuff that's been going on. Like the Russians must have like a pretty good sense of like our culture to like kind of know what to like push. Like, I'm just thinking like social media, like on Facebook and stuff I've seen. I mean, is that something that they're just better at doing than us? I mean, is it even possible for us to do that back towards the Russians? I mean, like how much of that is, understanding the culture and like to be able to like sway an election like this?
That's a great question.
You know what I mean?
That's a great question. And one way to answer that is to say they are much interested in us as the largest military and economic power in the world than we tend to be interested in them. Okay. In the Cold War, we had the benefit of rival ideologies. And it was very difficult to know what the Russians were thinking. And I think for the Russians, it was easier for them to know what we were thinking. In 1991, when the Russian Federation emerges, right? Russia still had all of its assets in the West and in the United States. And now the Russians were our friends. They could learn whatever they wanted. There were no restrictions. Russia was an open, wild West. I lived there then. It was crazy, right? But with the emergence of Putin and the rise of his power, laws have been enacted that restrict what you can know as a Westerner on how their government and how their industry, because they are linked, conduct business and what their objectives are. So it is far more easy for the Russians today to know where are the fights and what congressional districts where. All they have to do is to turn on CNN, Fox News, any of they will tell you, well, listen, in this congressional district, it's really close. Here's one that Trump had, but, we'll wonder in the 2026 elections. So in many ways, they don't have to build centers of excellence to understand what's going on in the United States. They can free ride on some of that.
I see. Great. It looks like we have a question in the chat. So this one's from Zheng Hua. What's your thoughts about the MITRE funding issue, which is very topical here? I know that it's being renewed just in time this morning so that it can continue updating the CW database for a few months. But going forward, is it sustainable for the organization, and what'll happen if funding dried out eventually?
Okay, so you've got a lot of questions wrapped in that one observation. Great, great discussion point. Just a couple of thoughts for you. First, so the MITRE funding issue is emblematic of what the Trump administration is kind of trying to impose. And the first is this notion of a restart, okay? That all things, excuse me, all things being equal, let us take time to review and assess what money's going where, right? You can read that as a political objective, as an economic objective, or as a governance priority. But the problem that the administration is having is milestones are set in a lot of these contracts, as you very well know, that are hitting where funding will need a waiver or some way to get activated. So what I'm trying to say is the objective here might be, hey, let's see really what's being spent where. We need to understand that, right? Absolutely legitimate and part of governance functions, right, by the US government, right? At the same time, there are real world, right, monies under contract that need to hit at certain times to go from different phases, as you well know, right? Those two things are colliding, right? Because what you need is somebody to stand up and say, hey, this is really important. Let me tell you why. We need some sort of waiver. We need something. However, can the system continue long term to keep going through these decision points? That is going to be, and as of right now, I see no reason to think it's going to change, right? The hope is over time it becomes more routinized, right? And for things, so here's a comment. I don't think anybody wants to endanger programs that provide for national security, right? Or health, or you name it, right? But they're caught up in this as well, might be a way of saying. If funding dries up, I don't know what the auditors are looking for. Were it to dry up, it dries up, right? And then it's a game of politics, right? Who is politically at the head of the table, who are able to get their requirements and needs satisfied the quickest? That's just the brutality of the way the system is playing out now. Again, I think there's every reason to believe that over time this will become routinized. You'll never worry about it again, right? I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
Well, let me just sign off
Sure.
here. I mentioned Chinese cyber sovereignty, and let me just 30-second overview. This is something you should pay attention to because it is also something the Russians really believe in. This is the notion that every state has cyber sovereignty over what they do in cyberspace. We would agree with that, with the exception of how the Chinese and the Russians view it is as follows. Not only does Russia have sovereignty whenever it interacts within cyberspace, but whoever interacts within cyberspace that touches Chinese sovereignty is subject to Chinese jurisdiction. So let me be very clear on what that could mean. You are on a listserv with someone, for example, from China. You are now touching Chinese sovereign jurisdiction. You say something very offensive to the leadership, about the leadership or the people, it doesn't matter, in China. Question: under their concept of an expansive notion of cyber sovereignty, are you now subject to their jurisdiction? Could you be subject to their jurisdiction in absentia, meaning courts take action in China against you they put out a global notice that you, of course, failed to find. And there is, for example, a court ruling against you in China. If you're like me, who go to China every once in a while, are you going to find yourself subject to arrest for violating through cyberspace Chinese cyber laws? And the answer is, I don't have an answer for you, right? That seems quite extreme. I'm an academic. I like to play with things like this. But it is, these are things that other folks like me talk about a lot. And again, Russia is right behind them saying, Russia has cyber sovereignty. We can do whatever we want in cyberspace. And if we don't like you, leave us alone. If you harm us, we're coming after you. So
Yeah,
thank you,
I
Michael.
don't, I guess I don't think it bodes very well for us being a more open society, I guess, I mean, that's just what comes with it, right? And, what can we do to deal with societies that are able to close themselves off more efficiently, I guess, like, the Great Firewall kind of thing. That I guess I don't know if that's our disadvantage, but maybe it's our advantage. I don't know. It's kind of hard to.
Well, it is certainly a moneymaker for China because they're selling the Great Cyber Firewall to other countries all throughout the world who want exactly what China has and can do.
Right. Right. Very interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought of that whole aspect of it, and the privacy and what we do online. It's could be kind of scary. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Love. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thanks for putting up with us with our problems with Zoom today. But this has been a very great talk, and we will have it up online here within the next week. But really appreciate it. So attendees, we have 2 more weeks left. So we'll see you back here next week, same time, Wednesday. We'll be back on Zoom unless something goes wrong again, but I'm pretty sure we'll be back there on Zoom. So we'll see you then. So thanks a lot, Richard. I really appreciate it.
Sure, Michael. And take care, everybody. Good luck.
Thanks. Take care.